The most neglected voice is that which should be sung. Hello and welcome to the Choir of the Mind. I appreciate all audience members taking the time out of their day to ponder some deep thoughts today. On the topic of deep thoughts, I have a person who I believe will have some insight on such matters, which is our guest, established author from Scarborough, Ontario, Sylvie Baudouin. Sylvie is an extremely imaginative and expressive writer who has been from her humble beginnings. She has struggled with the extreme highs and lows of her very eventful life, from enjoying the bliss and companionship of her friends to grieving the ones she had lost tragically. Sylvie's current and past life entail an interesting story. The themes within her early work and present work are tightly knit into many well-structured continuities that in which entail the experiences within her life. Sylvie has written so far many books, two of which have been autobiographies that serve as memoirs to the turmoil that Sylvie had faced in her life. Many of her stories had been analogous to many issues that criticize how the Canadian government had treated First Nations Indigenous people and how they still continue to suffer. She states that she takes inspiration in writing style from many well-renowned masters such as Ernest Hemingway, Harper Lee, and Cormac McCarthy. However, she also states that a big inspiration to the topics that she discusses had been inspired by the fellow Canadian author Richard Wagamese, a person so experienced within the nuances of emotion told through her writing is a person who I want to tackle the topic I have in mind, which is, how does perception affect our sense of individuality? Please say hello, Sylvie. Hello, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to openly talk about my books, but also about my life experience. You are correct in that it was colorful for me in the start, but thankfully I managed to find some stability within my life and my family. To quickly summarize the most eventful moments of my life, I lived in a shelter for a big part of my childhood. I went to a literacy center where I'd met a friend who I still connect to from time to time. Bing is his name. However, I had also tragically lost a good friend of mine there, Laura. I was bogged down by a lot of emotions that felt foreign, having been a child at the time. But after many years of the ache, I was able to heal from it, using my writing as a way to escape. Thus, much of my work has been influenced by this. On a personal note, I had developed a somewhat addiction towards cigarettes in my youth. Thankfully, I had kicked the habit of such a thing. I try to mention how it had affected me and interleave it within my stories, though not as much as I want to at the time. Now I wish to implement more of that into my future works. I think that specifically relates to how I'd perceive myself. To expand on it, many First Nations Canadians are subject to poor living conditions within their reservations, and because of that, a lot of them suffer from substance abuse, which had led to some stereotypes. The perception I had of drugs and becoming addicted to one was the same that many people have. They believed that it would never happen to them, as if they are completely invincible to the temptation. However, my perception of myself had become completely warped as I viewed myself as an addict, a stark contrast to the beliefs I had previously held. My sense of individuality had been blurred, and I saw myself as a smoker, but like many things, they are always susceptible to change as time goes on. So that's how I would answer the question on how perception had affected my individuality. Wow, you have such a good insight on this topic. I guess it should have been known, considering that your writing specifically delves into stuff like this. Though, thank you for your opinion. The next few questions are simply to understand a few of your opinions. Firstly, how do you think people have perceived you, and how do you think they perceive you now? Well, being a kid, most adults assumed I didn't understand anything. And I remember a specific instance where a doctor had assumed my mother was too poor to afford treatment. The factors of me being a kid and First Nations led to people to perceive me as insignificant. I have since made a name for myself, and thankfully that ideology for most people in how they perceive me has changed into a more positive viewpoint. Next question. How does thinking about your perception and reality affect you today? These days I have become more connected within myself. It helps to influence my writing if I truly know what I am and what I believe in. It also provides me mental clarity in my daily life. Simply knowing that I am in tune helps me out. Next question. How has being an author affected your viewpoint on reality? Having to think about these things days and months on end, constantly working on a story to represent these ideas is quite liberating. One would assume that if you are constantly reminding yourself about how you think, it would simply lead to more overthinking. But for me, it's nice to put my thoughts out on paper. It makes me happy to know that I was able to express my thoughts in a way that I appreciate. Next question. Are there any people who have specifically impacted your perception? Many people. For one, I can think of my brother. He is developmentally disabled. Where most people cannot see him as anyone special, for me, he is my brother. I know things about him that most don't know. I know that he is more than his disability. Because of him, I am able to look beneath the surface for a lot of people. Another smaller example is one of my friends in the shelter, Christy. She would always like to listen to my stories. She was usually ignorant to the messaging, yet I tried to show her as best I could. Her experiences have taught me to understand a person is not the sum of their mistakes. Thank you for having such insight into these topics. It was very impressive to dissect the mind of such a well-renowned author like yourself. May I ask what you thought of these questions? They were very well constructed. I appreciated taking the time to think how I would respond. To ask one last question, what changes do you think can be made for society so that the lingering negative perception that many people hold against one another doesn't persist? I believe it takes two things. One is simply for us to intermingle with each other more. As a kid, my friends, being in Laura, were completely different and had different backgrounds, yet I still think about how much fun we used to have, and we'd basically never take into consideration our differences. Simply enjoying our presence despite it all. I believe that people should reconnect to that childish wonder of meeting new people and bonding in spite of their differences. Another thing is simply introspection. My perception of myself had mellowed into a much more positive viewpoint when I had started expressing myself through writing. I believe that more people should look within themselves and try to understand why they might feel a certain way. With these two factors, I think society will improve how much negative perception there is. This has been a wonderful experience. Thank you for taking the time to speak on this, and thank you for providing me and the audience something to think and ponder about. This has been the Choir of the Mind. Thank you for listening.